Good evening and welcome, everyone. Is this on? Yes. My name is Geneviève Zubrzitsky. I'm director of the Weiser Center for Europe and Eurasia and professor of sociology here at the University of Michigan. And I would like to extend a special welcome to Dr. Katerina Tomljenović Borer and her family with us here tonight, as well as to the many friends and colleagues joining us on Zoom. I think we have about 75 participants on Zoom. So welcome to everyone. Thank you for joining us on a Friday evening, the first chilly day of the fall semester. In the past 12 months, I've had the honor and the pleasure of working with Dr. Borer to establish the Borka Tomljenović Southeast European Peace, Cooperation, and Conflict Fund at CREES, the Center for Russia, East European and Eurasian Studies. I have so many of those centers and they're just slightly different, so I apologize for that. I will call it CREES from now on. And with this fund, CREES will strengthen and elevate conversations regarding Southeast Europe by examining the formation and dissolution of Yugoslavia and analyzing the geopolitical, social, economic, religious, and ethnic factors underlying peace, cooperation, and conflict in the region. Another key goal of the fund is to extend this type of study to other multi-ethnic and multi-religious societies in Europe and beyond. The fund will support lectures like tonight's, conferences and film screenings that promote knowledge about Yugoslavia and other Southeast European countries and uses that knowledge to understand other cases. Dr. Borer, professor of kinesiology for many years at the University of Michigan, wanted to establish this fund to honor the extraordinary life of her mother, Borka Tomljenović, a woman who witnessed firsthand the tumultuous 20th century. Born in 1917, Borka spent her childhood and teenage years in her native Bosnia. She later studied in Zagreb and raised her family there in the 1950s. She relocated to Serbia in the early 1960s and lived in Belgrade until she immigrated to the United States during the collapse of communism and the disintegration of Yugoslavia in the 1990s. Borka was heartbroken to see her memories of peaceful coexistence between ethnic and religious groups in her native Bosnia torn by violent wars. She was heartbroken to witness the legacy of decades of productive cooperation between diverse groups nearly forgotten. And she published 3 memoirs to preserve and disseminate the memory of her experiences in Bosnia, Croatia, and Serbia. Bosnian Counterpoint, Requiem for Yugoslavia, and Neither on the Earth or in the Sky. And I want to direct your attention to the back of the room where Dr. Borer actually made available to us several copies of these 3 memoirs as a gift to commemorate actually to tonight's inaugural lecture. So please do not forget to grab your copies. Dr. Borer, it's an honor and privilege to be entrusted with a gift to honor the legacy of your exceptional mother. Your gift will help us solidify the University of Michigan's reputation as the premier institution for Yugoslavia and Southeastern European studies. And now I'd like to invite Professor Benjamin Payloff, who's CREES director, to introduce tonight's distinguished speaker. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Zubrzitsky. I'm Benjamin Payloff, professor of Slavic languages and literatures and of comparative literature, and the director of the Center for Russian, East European, and Eurasian Studies here at the University of Michigan. It gives me great pleasure to introduce the speaker for our inaugural Borka Tomljenović lecture, Robert D. Kaplan. Inaugural because this will be, from now forward, an annual event and a regular and celebratory reminder of our university's long commitment to the study of the past, present, and future of the former Yugoslavia, the Balkans, and Southeast Europe more generally. Inaugural also because today's talk activates, as it were, the Borka Tomljenović Southeast European Peace, Cooperation, and Conflict Fund, which has been established by a generous gift from Katarina Tomljenović-Bohr, Professor Emerita of Kinesiology at the University of Michigan, as you heard, in honor of her mother Borka, a longtime member of the university community about whom we've just also heard. Private acts of generosity, like Professor Bohr's, are, as those of us who work in academia well know, transformative. Not only do they fund new research and foster young careers, while also allowing us the opportunity to engage directly with important and productive voices, as today's gathering clearly attests, but they also mark a path. They declare a commitment, and at the same time, they issue a challenge to us, in fact, to make good on that commitment and to walk that path, and to do so with our curiosity, our dedication, and our reason. So on behalf of the Center for Russian, East European, and Eurasian Studies, or CREAS, our faculty and student affiliates, our enormously capable and knowledgeable staff, and our many stakeholders in Southeast Michigan and across the world, I want to take this opportunity to thank Professor Bohr for marking that path, declaring that commitment, and issuing that challenge. I also wish to thank Professor Zubczycki again, this time for all of her work with Professor Bohr to establish the Borka Tomljenović Fund, as well as Małgorzata Kowalczyk, Liz Malinkin, Rachel Brichta, Arthur Mengazi, and everyone within the Weiser Centers who has helped bring the Tomljenović Fund and today's event to fruition. Now, just a little bit of housekeeping. Today's talk is being delivered live in Ann Arbor on the campus of the University of Michigan, as well as over Zoom. We anticipate that both of the audiences will have questions or comments for our speaker, and we welcome those from both audiences. If you're joining us over Zoom, the way to make a question or comment for our speaker is through the little Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom webinar panel. And if you are here with us in person, and all of you here are, we ask that you write your question on a note card, which our staff will distribute and then collect, and we will then give those questions, summarizing them sometimes or joining them together to deliver them to the speaker. Please keep your questions brief, I beg you. And if you are handwriting, please do so legibly. And we're going to then relay those questions to the speaker. Our speaker, Robert Kaplan, is a distinguished author, journalist, and lecturer on history, geography, and foreign affairs. He has written nearly 24 books on timely, often urgent topics, including Soldiers of God with the Mujahideen in Afghanistan, 1990, Balkan Ghosts, which I have here, from 1993, still in print, Mediterranean Winter, The Pleasures of History and Landscape in Tunisia, Sicily, Dalmatia, and Greece, from 2004, In Europe's Shadow, Two Cold Wars and a 30-Year Journey Through Romania and Beyond, 2016, and most recently, Adriatic, A Concert of Civilization at the End of the Modern Age. This is a thinker whose breadth of experience spans long enough to be able to separate 30 years between two books reflecting on similar themes, and this will be an opportunity for us to ask how perspectives may have changed over that time. Readers of the Atlantic Monthly will be familiar with Mr. Kaplan's extensive reporting on foreign affairs for the magazine since the mid-1980s. Though chances are just as good that you have seen his work in the many other publications to which he has regularly contributed, including Foreign Affairs magazine, the Washington Post, and the Wall Street Journal, among many others. He has held positions with advisory boards and policy groups within and adjacent to the federal government, including the Defense Policy Board and the Eurasia Group. And he is currently Robert Strausz-Hupé Chair in Geopolitics at the Foreign Policy Research Institute in Philadelphia, having received the Institute's Benjamin Franklin Public Service Award in 2009. The title of his talk today is Returning to the Groove of History, and will address the international order currently taking shape and the difficulties and advantages it poses for our regions of interest and the world. Please join me in welcoming Robert Kaplan.
Well, thank you very much, Ben. Really, thank you. It's a great privilege and honor to be here with you today and with the people listening over Zoom. And it's so appropriate for the talk I have to give that I'm here, under the auspices of the Center for European Eurasian Studies, East European and Eurasian Studies, and also thank you for the gift that established this this award, the Borka Tomljenović Award. Let me start. About 115 years ago, there was a very, very distinguished American historian, Henry Adams, who wrote a famous book, The Education of Henry Adams. It was an autobiography. And he was the great-great-grandson of the second president, John Adams, the grandson of the sixth president, John Quincy Adams. He was not a politician, he was an historian and a diplomat. And he was in London, and he wrote in 1907 that the perennial problem of Europe in the past, in the present, and into the distant future will be Russia. Russia will be the theme of Europe and what happens in it. And he said this because Russia was just too big, 11 time zones, too Eurasian, and to fit inside the tidy systems of France and Germany and what is today the other democracies. It would always be a struggle with Russia. And he died, I think he died that year in 1907. And in 1914, World War I started. And the first great battle of World War I was Tannenberg in what is today Poland. And it was between the Kaiser's German army and Russia, the Tsarist army. And the Tsarist army was terrifically defeated, a real humiliation. And that started the process which led to the abdication of Nicholas II and the Russian Revolution. It all started at Tannenberg on the Eastern Front in World War I. There's a lot in the newspapers now about how, Russians don't treat their leaders who lose wars very kindly. And the allusion is to the Russo-Japanese War of 1905, but it's really the Battle of Tannenberg, So Russia not only helped determine World War I, because it led to the Russian Revolution, it helped determine the century and what would happen in the whole century. Then there was World War II, where the worst battles were again on the Eastern Front between Germany and what was called the Soviet Union, which of course was Russia plus a lot of other imperial-like holdings. And World War II led to the Cold War with, again, the Soviet-Russian army in the center of Europe controlling the whole, or most of the eastern half of the continent. So it was Russia, 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 exactly as Henry Adams had predicted. And then we got an historical interruption, as I call it. The Cold War ended in such a dramatic and one-sided way that it led to the collapse of the Soviet Union. And for a decade after, a long decade after, from say 1989 to 2001, 2002, Russia was in semi-chaos. It was officially a democracy, but institutions were weak. The middle class, or what existed of it, was destroyed. The currency was destroyed. Much of the wealth of the state was absconded with by large crime groups from the intelligence agencies, etc. And so Russia was weak. So the 1990s, Russia was not a factor. And guess what? That was a big reason why NATO and the United States were able to intervene as they did in the former Yugoslavia in 1995 and 1999. Because remember, the Balkans were historically, traditionally a zone of Russian imperial influence, but Russia was too weak to offer up any resistance. Had Russia been as strong as it had been or would be, the Balkan wars and the intervention simply would have been different. It would have involved some negotiation with Russia. But that was the 1990s. And then in 2001, there was what I call the great 9/11 head fake. It was a head fake because it was so traumatic, the worst violent event in American history since Pearl Harbor. Russia was weak at the time. Vladimir Putin had just come into office, and it wasn't clear which way he was going. This was very early days. And the Chinese had not yet really begun to build their great Navy and Air Force. So because there was no great power struggles at that time, at that moment, it was assumed in Washington that Islamic terrorism was the new strategic threat and the only strategic threat. And that led to the post-9/11 wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. And when the US came out of that head fake, as I like to call it, well, Russia and China were back on the table as very, very powerful. And again, the problem became Russia. And with the war in Ukraine, we are back to this groove of history that Henry Adams announced in 1907, essentially. And it really is, Lenin had a famous statement. It's a cliche. It's recited so often. And Lenin was an awful man, but it's a great remark, And Lenin said, decades could go along and nothing happens. But then days and weeks and months can go along and decades happen. And that's where we are now, because it's very possible that, that the coming weeks and months on the battlefield in Ukraine, the coming days, could determine the future trajectory of not only Russia and Ukraine, but Europe too. It all depends on the battlefield now. This is exactly what Lenin meant, when he made his remark when he was in exile in Zurich. So we're back to history, and not only back to the groove of history, we're back to considerations of empire. Empire has become a dirty word. Imperialism is bad, empires are bad. But I would submit to you that it's impossible really to fully appreciate the world situation without an objective study of empire. The Russians in Ukraine trying to regain what was a Romanov imperial holding, the Chinese in Taiwan trying to regain what was a Qing dynastic imperial holding. The Iranians, if you look at the map of Iranian terrorist influence, it totally overlaps with that of the ancient Achaemenid, Sassanid, and Qajar and other Persian dynasties, imperial dynasties in history. Turkey very openly celebrates its Ottoman past. There's no apologies about that at all. In fact, empire is looked well upon in many places, just not in the West, essentially. And therefore, to really understand the style and the motivation of a number of these great powers and middle-level powers, we need to revisit the study of empire in a neutral kind of objective way. Because remember, empires govern most of the people of the earth for most of history. And And therefore, and democracy has only been around a few hundred years, essentially. Now, let me talk a bit about Europe. Europe is always changed on the map. It's been very unstable on the map. There was a time 200 years after Rome in the West had collapsed, when Latin was still the lingua franca in North Africa. Imagine that, where it was a Roman map, a Mediterranean map. Places that are today Algiers, Tunis, Cairo were part of Europe, you know? And then what happened was the Sassanid Persian Empire went to war against the Byzantine Empire, and they both were so weakened that it allowed for the rise of an Arab Islamic empire that swept across North Africa, and this Latin lingua franca area became Arabic speaking. And Europe, in a way, moved north. It moved north into the Franco-German lands, and then the Dark Ages, the Middle Ages came, and what became the West emerged. But it was all interconnected with something that happened in what is today Turkey and Iran, you know? So Europe has always been influenced by its shadow zones, as I would put it. And now I'd like to give a consideration of two books that I wrote, Balkan Ghosts and 30 Years Later, Adriatic, essentially, that deal with these questions. Adriatic really deals with these questions of the spread and the changeability of Europe on the map. Let me deal with Balkan Ghosts first, and let me make an aside. This will be a long aside, because I've never really spoken about this to anybody. You know, Balkan Ghosts was published in 1993, but it was excerpted in the Atlantic Monthly in 1989, before the Berlin Wall even fell. And I wrote an essay for the Wall Street Journal predicting the demise of Yugoslavia, also in 1989. Just after the Berlin Wall fell, 2 weeks after, I said, the media is buzzing about Central Europe. They're beating that term to death. The Balkans is a term they haven't heard yet, but it will determine the history of the last decade of the 20th century. And Balkan Ghosts went on to sell, if you combine all the language editions and everything, 500,000 copies at this point, which for a book like that is amazing. And the only time I came close was with The Revenge of Geography in 2012. You know, it's all one thing I know. I'm an author who's published with Random House for over a quarter century, and have a book coming out in January with Yale University Press. So with both trade and academic publishers, and I can tell you, book publishing is all about timing, you know? It's all about timing. And what was the timing of Balkan Ghosts? As I said, in 1989, The Atlantic published an excerpt called Third World Europe, or Europe's Third World. And it was about everyone's concentrating now on the wars in Central America, because the 1980s were a time when the whole media elite and intellectual establishments were wrapped up in the wars in El Salvador, Nicaragua, and Lebanon. That's where all the foreign correspondents went. And at that time, I wrote about the Balkans, you know, essentially. And I said, because this is a region of Europe, but it's not like the rest of Europe. It has unresolved national historical problems that have been temporarily put to sleep by the Cold War. And the Cold War was already crumbling apart in the late 1980s. And it was visible because I was going back and forth to Hungary, to the what became the Czech Republic, to Romania, to Bulgaria, and I saw the dissolution of the Soviet Empire. So, and because I got to it early, Balkan Ghosts was the only book, trade book, I should say, trade book, in bookstores at the time the war started, and that's what led to its sales. You know, many authors went to the Balkans in the night during the wars, but they didn't write their books till the late 90s, and by the time they were published, we were already in a war in the Middle East, in the Gulf with Iraq. So those books didn't do as well. Now, when Balkan Ghost was first published, it got very nice reviews in the New York Times and the Washington Post. I was asked to write pieces for the New York Review of Books, the late editors, and then something happened. It was reported a few months later that Clinton had read the book and had decided that it had so made him negative about the region, so depressed him about the region, that it was a factor in delaying humanitarian intervention. And then everything flipped. I started to be attacked, sometimes by the same people who had praised the book before. And from my point of view, is very simple. You don't intervene, you only intervene in regions where the human you only intervene in regions because the level of conflict is so awful. Otherwise, why intervene? The question doesn't even come up except in places where where the conflict between groups is so awful that it requires intervention. So for me to write a book and say that there's a lot of unresolved issues in this part of the world is just to say, well, it's another day. That shouldn't dissuade you from intervention. You intervene where strategic matters intersect with moral matters. That's generally what leads to military intervention. So, and I was approaching the Balkans as a realist. These are unresolved ethnic problems. And it's the first war in Europe since the Cold War ended, essentially. And it can spur refugee movements into Central Europe. It's a US strategic interest. Because if we don't intervene in the former Yugoslavia, NATO expansion is threatened. So for me, it was very simple. You could write a book that was in many ways very dark, very harshly pessimistic, and yet still at the same time intervene to set things to rights. There's no contradiction in that. In fact, before you intervene, you should think the worst of a region. That, you should worst case scenario everything. That way you avoid all the bad outcomes. That's one thing the younger Bush administration did not do in Iraq. Before going into Iraq, somebody should have given him, a sort of a Balkan Ghost lecture. And, and then if he did intervene, it would have turned out differently. Because the Clinton administration, worst case scenario, everything. And as a result, the interventions were successful. They ended the war at the time. Things may have not gone so well afterwards, but they did end the war at the time. Now, that was in the early 1990s. In the about starting 6 years ago, I went back to the region. Well, I should say I wrote a book on Romania. About 8-9 years ago. But this was the first time I concentrated in 30 years, a third of a century, on the former Yugoslavia. So the first third of Adriatic is about Italy. And the second 2/3 are about Slovenia, Croatia, Montenegro, and Albania. And I saw, in many cases, the different Balkans. First of all, I was concentrating on the Dalmatian coast. The book is called Adriatic. It's about the coast. So it wasn't about the inland, so to speak. So that colored it. But the region had changed dramatically. Let's take Croatia, for example. Croatia is now at the center of the world tourist boom. I think they get 15 million visitors every summer for a country with a population of 4 million. In the intervening 30 years, big, wide superhighways have been built by points along the Croatian coast, all going to Zagreb. And what that did, that had a real strategic effect. It changed the personality of the country, because what it did is it took like a 6-hour uncomfortable train journey or bus ride, and you could now cover the distance in 90 minutes. essentially. To get to the airport in Zagreb once, I left Split like with, you know, I did it in 90 minutes, you know? So that was, so Croatia has become a Mediterranean country, much less than what was quote unquote a Balkan country before. So in many ways, the region has changed dramatically. But on the other hand, ethnic national questions are still hotly debated between groups there, one has to say. And when I interviewed people in Zagreb in 2017, 2018, I didn't hear things that much different than when I interviewed them for Balkan Ghosts 30 years before. The Croatian Catholic Church was on the right, minimizing the damage done by the Ustasi during World War II. And then you had these Croatian intellectuals and thinkers who are on the opposite side, essentially. So, but here, it's subtle. There's not going to be another war in the Balkans, I don't believe, because what caused the war fundamentally was the collapse of a country with a vast army and vast weaponry. You know, the Yugoslav National Army collapsed. There were millions of assault rifles around, and it got distributed to various groups. And that was, without that, the wars could not have happened. But nowadays, there's no country to collapse. It's so, you know, they're all spread, divided into their constituent parts. There's no energy for another war. But all these hot debates that go on ethnic national questions have more or less sapped the energy out of the country, the political energy, so that Croatia, and even more so Montenegro and other places, as much as they have developed in the last 30 years, have not developed to the point that they should have. They should have reached the level of Malaysia or Singapore or someplace like that. But they haven't. So it's like a weight holding them down. And then you have all these young people who have left Croatia, gone to high-tech jobs in Ireland and all of that. That's the real dynamic, which is the decreasing population, and because of the most educated liberal people are leaving, you know, that's really what's going on. And so I found a different region with different problems. Albania changed more dramatically than any place I had seen. Remember, Balkan Ghosts was about how the Balkans looked at the time at the very end of communism and the refuse of communism, the hatreds that developed under communism or from before communism. Nowadays, you've had 30 years of capitalist development. Albania was utterly unrecognizable. It may still be corrupt, may have a lot of organized crime, but the development is impressive. You know, despite everything, it looks suburbia in many places. To say nothing of Montenegro and Croatia, though. One thing that I found is it's still, as you go south from Slovenia to Albania, every time you cross a border, the standard of living goes down, the per capita income goes down. And because you're leaving the Central European Catholic areas, entering into the more Eastern European Orthodox areas, those things still matter. It may sound essentialistic and generalizations, but what I always say about generalizations are, to generalize, individuals are much more real than groups. Individual identity is much greater than group identity. But that doesn't mean that group identity does not exist. It just means it's a much weaker, more slippery commodity than individual identity. And even though it cannot be quantified, so social sciences stay away from it, it still matters. You know, it still has an effect. So Adriatic is a more happy book. It's the most introspective book that I've ever written. And one of the things I talk, you know, you may ask, well, how do you feel about Clinton's interpretation of your book? How did that affect you mentally, psychologically, et cetera? It's a fair question. I make a distinction between guilt and remorse. Remorse can include guilt, but remorse is more of a sad feeling, and guilt is just plain guilt. I feel, and have always felt, and will feel the rest of my life, tremendous remorse for how Clinton interpreted Balkan goes. But I don't feel guilty because I did my job. I spent years in the 1980s going back and forth to the Balkans, interviewing people, recording what they said, and writing about what I experienced. And what I experienced was very relevant, some would say clairvoyant, to what would happen in the following decade. So it's remorse, not guilt. And it's remorse that I'll bear for the rest of my life that I can't change. I have a book coming out in January called The Tragic Mind with Yale University Press, and it deals with these questions a bit. And it's just a sad, it's just, it's a hard truth of human existence that we often have to take responsibility for what is not our fault. We do that every day with small things, but it gets larger. Politicians are very familiar with this because they're often taking responsibility for what somebody below them, did in their name or something. But that's how I feel, about Balkan ghosts. Let me switch the subject to give it more of a geopolitical edge to talk about China. Because we live, we're 7.7 billion people on Earth, and we're going to be 11 billion people at the end of the century. And that includes, and that takes into account lowering birth rates. It takes into account, a lot of things, how birth rates are changing. We're even as we lower birth rates, there are going to be 35% more human beings on the planet at the end of the century. And more human beings will live in urban settings. We're already more than 50% of humanity lives in an urban situation. It's going to be closer to 70% at in 2100. And what that means is we live in a very claustrophobic world, a very anxious, claustrophobic world where a crisis in one part of the earth can affect another part of the earth instantaneously. We know that with financial markets, but it's also true in geopolitics. And nobody is studying the war in Ukraine more closely than the Chinese. The Chinese are great students of war. They studied minutely the US-led interventions in the Balkans in the 1990s. They studied both Gulf Wars, and they're studying every aspect of the war in Ukraine. And what they're doing is they're trying to prepare their economy and their society for a wartime situation by making it more self-reliant, more autarkic, not autarkic, but in that direction, so to speak. The Russians have no corps of non-commissioned officers that's any good, corporals, sergeants, petty officers, etc. The Chinese are spending lots of money on educating their non-commissioned officers in the Navy and Air Force. The Chinese are doing everything opposite to the Russians, essentially. The Chinese will not make the mistakes in Taiwan that the Russians are making with Ukraine. In a sense, we have it easy with this war because, who would have thought that Putin, who is seen to be such a great tactician up until February 24th, 2022, would so incompetently, and the generals he appointed, so incompetently manage this war. What's been revealed in Ukraine is a third world army, an army prone to desertion, bad morale, violence against civilians, weak non-commissioned officer corps, and no logistics. There's a saying in the military that amateurs discuss strategy and professionals discuss logistics. You want to invade and send tanks to Kiev, you got to get your food up to the front line, the laundry up to the front line, equipment and ammunition up to the front line. They all have to move with the invading force. So that, you have to have portable hot showers up to the front line. All this has to be thought of, and the Russians didn't do any of this. The US did it in Iraq, and learned. The one thing about the US war in Iraq was how the US Army improved as the war went along. They learned things. It was a high learning curve. The Army performed well. The strategy was bad, but that's the part of civilians, the strategy part. China. Will the West or the US have, for the next 10 or 20 years, be in a state of a Cold War with China? And my answer is categorically yes. And the reasons are several that I'll give you some insight into. The first is militarily. If you're, as a Chinese senior colonel said to me, we're doing nothing in the South China Sea that you Americans didn't do in the Caribbean in the late 19th and early 20th century. The South China Sea is our Caribbean, so stay out. It's our adjacent blue water extension of our dry land territory. And they feel the same way about the East China Sea and Taiwan. And for the United States to send warships from half a world away to the South China Sea is, from the Chinese point of view, unprincipled, hegemonic, imperialistic. The US looks at it differently. The Pentagon is absolutely committed to Asia. In fact, if there's one area of the world where the Pentagon gets emotional about, it's Asia. The Ukraine war is something the Pentagon has to deal with. And the possibility of nuclear weapons is something the Pentagon has to deal with. But it doesn't want to deal with it. What it wants to deal with is Asia. Because in 1853, Commodore Matthew Perry opened Japan to trade. The United States fought a decade-long war in the Philippines at the turn of the 20th century. There was World War II in the Pacific. There was the Korean War. There was the Vietnam War. The only U.S. aircraft carrier strike group based outside of the US is based in Asia, in Japan. The Pentagon gets very emotional about Asia. So the Chinese and American military ideas about Asia are 180 degrees opposite. Then there's cyber. Cyber may be a great thing in our personal lives and in financial markets, but it's a big negative in war. Because the enemy is not 100 miles away, it's one click away. And the US and China have been engaged in a hot cyber war for a number of years already. Cyber is a destabilizing element in the US-China relationship, and that's only going to get worse as time goes on. And there's trade, which I'm not going to go into because we know about that. We're going from free trade to trade restrictions. And tellingly, the Biden administration's trade policy to China is not that much different from the Trump administration's. That's part of the Trump foreign policy that the Biden administration has kept. It's without the craziness, of course, but it's basically the same policy. And finally, there's ideology. For a third of a century after the death of Mao Zedong and before the rise of Xi Jinping, China was a collegial, risk-averse, semi-enlightened, authoritarian system that the US business community loved, made a lot of money there, that US journalists respected, that Congress had good relations with, and that basically China had friends in Washington. China has no friends left in Washington anymore because Xi Jinping has gone from risk-averse to risk-taking to a hard-edged, intrusive authoritarianism without retirement limits, that's not collegial. It's one man and his clique around him. And so China has no more friends in Washington. And so that's where we are. We're dealing with Ukraine now. And Ukraine, we have the benefit, Machiavelli wrote, he said, I can I can advise you, my prince, about virtu, which means manliness, capability, and that's 50% of it. But the other 50%, fortuna, which is fortune or luck, there's no advice for it. You know, you either have it or you don't, essentially. And with the war in Ukraine, the West has the fortuna of a miscalculating Russia that invaded a country with a third world army, thinking it was a first world army. That's a stroke of fortune. And now it's a matter of managing the end game and hoping that could be done without weapons of mass destruction. But the West has been fortunate in its enemies, just like the elder Bush was fortunate with an inflexible, relatively useless Iraqi standing army in Kuwait in 1990. But don't expect Taiwan. And Taiwan, the South China Sea and East China Sea all go together in warfare. Don't expect a war in Taiwan to be this lucky. You know, for the Chinese to be this incompetent and not to miscalculate. So Europe is, let me just end with this note. You keep reading about how the Ukraine war, if it ends in a way we want it to end, will lead to democracy in Russia. People speculate on this. And now we read about we could have democracy in Iran. You know, people speculate on this. We have to also think, realists have to think about the perils of post-autocracy. Because the problem is that these regimes, Putin in Russia and the Ayatollahs in Iran, have so decimated civil society. They have so decimated institutions, normal institutions, that not only have they governed awfully and brought their countries to dire straits, but they've made it virtually impossible for anyone to succeed them. Because after they leave, there could really be chaos and anarchy. Look what happened in Russia in the 1990s. It'll be no easier after Putin left. You know, people should be studying the 1990s in Russia now, because we don't want to make the same mistakes again that we made after the Berlin Wall fell. And remember, when the Ayatollahs replaced the Shah, they replaced one bureaucracy with another, because there already was a clerical Shiite bureaucracy that just slotted in as the Shah's bureaucrats left. And there was no chaos in Iran. The Iranian Revolution may have been horrifying, but there was no chaos. You know, one regime and bureaucracy quickly replaced another. That's not going to happen this time. What's going to happen this time is the country could break apart. You could have real chaos. There's no leader to this opposition. So what we're going to face in Russia and in Iran after these regimes fall, and they will fall, is a period where democracy promotion gets even harder. You know, right now it's about cheerleading, but it's going to go from cheerleading to actual implementation, which is always much, much harder. So welcome to the world. Welcome to a world where we're all interconnected and where there's no place to hide anymore, because every place can be strategic now. It isn't like there used to be, where some areas of the world are more important than others. Every place matters now because of interconnectivity. It matters strategically in a way that it didn't. Thank you very much, and we'll have questions. Yeah.
So thank you very much, Mr. Kaplan, for this wonderful talk. As we announced before, we will be taking questions in the form of note cards. So if you have questions that you wish to share with our speaker, please jot them down on a note card. We have center staff who are collecting those, and we also have some questions coming in over Zoom. So we'll just take a minute to gather questions. we will begin, I think, with a question from our distinguished guests. And it's quite direct. Is American empire different from those empires that came before?
That's a great question. America doesn't have an empire, but it is in an imperial-like condition or situation. Yet when America spread westward beyond the Mississippi, and for decades, the Western territories were not states, they were holdings. America was in an imperial situation. Abraham Lincoln was an imperial president, in a way, in the Western territories. The Philippine War was straight empire. The Spanish-American War, was the beginning of America's imperial-like situation, even before World War I. If you look at where the American military is around the world, the strength of the American dollar, not just now, but normally, it's still the world's reserve currency. The way I would put it is, we deny the fact that we're imperial, but in fact, all the problems we have to deal with are the similar problems that empires throughout history had to deal with. So we're kind of in a reluctant empire.
So I'm going to combine two different questions because I love when this happens. They speak to each other. One question was whether NATO expansion, it says is, but I think the question could be is, was, or would be wise strategically. And the other is related, says, one of our guests asks how the expansion of the European Union contributed to sorting out ethnic questions and the possibility of conflict.
Great questions. First of all, when the Cold War ended, George Kennan, the great American strategist of the Cold War, was against NATO expansion anywhere, because he said that would make Russia an enemy. And other people have echoed that, like the political scientist John Mearsheimer was against NATO expansion. My view is that given the way the Cold War ended so decisively, it was inevitable that NATO would expand to the former Warsaw Pact. And this was, what made it more inevitable was the unification of Germany. So that expanding to places like Poland, south to Bulgaria, were pretty much inevitable. Expanding to the Baltic states was more problematic because since 1940, the Baltic states had been part of the Soviet Union, however reluctantly. And loose talk about expanding NATO to Ukraine, to Georgia during the color revolutions about 20 years ago, that really set the Russians in a rage, in a sense. I think that here's how I put it. There's this debate going on now. You may have noticed it between Anne Applebaum and John Mearsheimer. John Mearsheimer says it's all about geopolitics. It's all about chess pieces, movements on the board, geography. And Anne Applebaum says, no, it's all about individuals. It's all about a character like Zelensky, a character like Putin, etc. They're both right, essentially. And that's what statesmanship is ultimately about. Great statesmen have great geopolitical chessboard minds, but they also zero in on the individual they're negotiating with and can read him or her very, very closely. As I will put it in my next book, it's all about geography until the next minute it's all about Shakespeare. And that's basically it. And great statesmen figure this out. Henry Kissinger can write 50 pages about Golda Meir, Zhou Enlai, but he also is moving pieces on the chessboard. It's always both. Geography and geopolitics sets the context. It's the stage setting, but the people acting on the stage are individual human beings prone to delusions, emotions, and just, a word said at a summit meeting can affect history for 10 million people. Kind of. So I think that the NATO expansion set the context for a Ukrainian-Russian, for a question to emerge. But because Ukraine, surrounded more or less on three sides by Russia with no mountain range or land border, will always matter more to Russia than it will matter to the West. And therefore, there's this conflict determined by geography and geopolitics. But that doesn't mean that Vladimir Putin doesn't, he's completely responsible for the invasion, because another Russian leader may not have invaded. He may not even have gotten close to that point. And a new Russian leader may withdraw his forces or disown Putin or something like that. So it's all about Shakespeare too. That's how I would answer the question. NATO expansion helps set the context for the current war, but the current war happened because of decisions of individuals. Oh, and there was another part about the EU can assuage ethnic conflict.
Yes, that was
Yeah. One thing I learned researching Adriatic was that these ethno-national questions, which will not lead to another war, I don't believe, but which sap the energy out of politics in some of these countries, can only be permanently ended by the spread of the EU into the remaining Balkan countries. Because the EU is sort of an empire itself. It's a benign empire. It's bureaucrats in Brussels and Northwestern Europe determining how much fat should be in yogurt in Bulgaria or Greece or Romania. The EU is all about little things. It's about daily life and rules and regulations. And under the benign imperial umbrella of the EU, these countries can come to a solution. They can't do it on their own. So the EU has to have the energy to expand into the rest of the Balkans.
Just so you know that there's some method to my madness, I'm actually grouping the questions so that we're moving from the Balkans into Ukraine and Eastern Europe, and then we will get to China as well. There are some, I put them in order. And if there are more questions coming, please do pass them over and we'll add them to the stack. This is a very interesting, again, very direct question having to do with Ukraine and empire. Why is it that from our Western strategic point of view, we see the war in Ukraine as an imperial war and not as a local conflict, the way Western media often perceived what happened with the dissolution of Yugoslavia?
That's interesting. That's because the Ukraine was part of historic Russia under the Russian empires and was also in many ways the birthplace of the Russian nation. So that the Ukraine war is more transparently imperial because it harks back to the Romanov dynasty. But the Balkan wars were different because the Habsburg Empire left the Balkans after World War I. The Ottoman Empire left the rest of the Balkans after World War I. Remember the Habsburg and Ottoman empires, and I have this in a recent piece in Foreign Affairs, where they were empires, but they were cosmopolitan. They protected minorities. They were basically benign. Too. And what they gave birth to were more uni-ethnic aggressive states. Once the umbrella of empire was gone, it was one group against another group, essentially, and not just in the Balkans, but in the Middle East, especially in Mesopotamia, in Syria, especially. This happened. So the Balkans are really post-imperial. In a sense. Also, the wars in the Yugoslavia happened after the end of the Cold War, when the Russian sphere of the Soviet sphere of influence collapsed. So this is what happened. You know, as I've written, empires emerge out of chaos, but when empires collapse, they leave chaos in their wake.
That's unfortunately very much the case. Kind of playing into the counterfactual. If Russia is defeated in Ukraine, will it then lose its conceptual privileged status of being, for example, the only country named individually?
That's right.
In the name of our center.
Yeah.
You know, would it simply be, would we become the center for East European and Eurasian studies? And that would include Russia. Or does Russia have some kind of conceptual status that requires us to contend with the idea of Russia separately?
I think Russia's already lost the war in Ukraine. I think now the drama is how the loss affects politics in Moscow. You know, that's where we're switching into. It's, you know, it is already lost. But I don't believe that Ukraine can be a full-fledged member of NATO or the EU unless Russia dramatically weakens. And remember, Russia is not well institutionalized the way that China is. If Xi Jinping were to get very sick tomorrow, there would be a mechanism for replacing him, rather smooth. If Putin loses power for whatever reason, there is no mechanism. You know, it could be very messy, it could be bloody, it could be a low-calorie version of the former Yugoslavia, in a sense. You know, when you think of Russia's holdings in the Northern Caucasus, in the Kuril Islands, in the Far East, etc. So that I think, you know, that's the question now. Russia has already lost the war. The question is, will this affect Russian politics in the Kremlin, and how so? Will it do so? Or can Putin somehow survive this devastating defeat simply because nobody really wants his job, because they may not last very long either?
That allows us, actually, the questions now will pivot kind of toward China, or comparatively, really, because you're following the comparison you've already been drawing. I think many of us who are engaged in the region still wonder why February 24th? Why not some other day? Why that day? Why February? What was the catalyst for this particular invasion? So one of the members of our audience has asked what you think about the catalyst. What could the catalyst be for a Chinese intervention in Taiwan?
Okay, that's a very good question. I think there's an irony here. One of the catalysts for the invasion in February was the disastrous American withdrawal from Afghanistan, because that was handled so incompetently. There was so much chaos involved that Putin read weakness into the Biden administration, when in fact, the withdrawal from Afghanistan, the chaos of it, led the Biden administration to strengthen internally and to get its act together internally, because they knew that reputations were on the line. You know, suddenly, you know, relationships, bureaucratic connections between the Pentagon, the White House, the CIA, et cetera, they realized they had to improve that. They could not afford politically to have another Afghanistan, essentially. So Putin read weakness even as the Biden administration was strengthening. And Putin, remember, up until February 24th, almost everything he tried succeeded. He kept pushing. In Syria, the Obama administration did nothing. In Georgia in 2008, the younger Bush administration did nothing. Essentially, he kept pushing and there was no response, or too little response. And he thought now is the time. He misread Germany completely. You know, he said the Germans are compromised. They need Russian gas. Their elite is cynical. essentially. Gerhard Schroeder is not the bad guy. He was the front man for most of the German establishment at the time, who wanted a deal with Russia for commercial and economic reasons. So I think he figured now was the time, or, he had a window of opportunity. And the Chinese will look at it similarly. Is there, when there is a window of opportunity for? Now, there's a debate in the US foreign policy community about this. One side said China's going to keep getting stronger and stronger for at least another decade, so they're better off waiting to invade Taiwan. There's a new book out by two respectable political scientists who say, no, China has peaked. Its economic problems are disastrous. They're dull to go into, but I won't go into it, but just that they are disastrous, and that the time for China to invade is now, So that debate is ongoing in the pages of foreign affairs, foreign policy, and elsewhere. But clearly how Xi Jinping reads the situation will depend. And also, it may not be a land invasion of Taiwan or a cross-straits invasion. It could be something much more subtle. Keep strengthening, choking off Taiwan with more and more ships, launching cyber attacks that demoralize the Taiwanese population. It doesn't have to be the kind of blunt instrument that Putin used in Ukraine.
This next question kind of relates to exactly that point, is the question of whether or not the globalization 2.0 you've been describing makes interdependencies that increase the economic cost of war so much that no one wants to get involved in a war. Russia is an interesting case in that it has, other than fossil fuels, relatively little interdependency, whereas the Chinese economy is deeply interconnected.
Just to review, I wrote an essay where I defined globalization 1.0 and 2.0. And 1.0 is 1989 to a few years ago, which was a good news story, spread of democracy, free markets, Davos elite, all eradication of poverty, all that good stuff. And then globalization 2.0, I said, was less of a good news story. It was about using technology to monitor, the lives of millions of people in China, about, less free trade, more tariffs, re-rise of authoritarianism, middle-class angst and populism, and all of that. Yes, that's true. Russia was not completely dependent on the world economy, whereas China, and that's an advantage for the Chinese, because nobody can really boycott China in the event of a war with Taiwan in the way we could boycott Russia. And nobody's going to go along with us on that either. I mean, there are too many interconnections there. So in China's degree of being interwoven, and even the engine of the world economy, on the one hand cushions the possibility of war, makes it less likely, but it also makes China stronger in the case of a war, because the boycotting against Russia by the EU, by the United States, can't happen in the case of China in that way. Kind of. Now, remember, there was a book published over 100 years ago by Norman Angell called The Grand Illusion, which is about, and he published this book like 4 years before World War I broke out. And he said there'll never be any more world wars because the world economy is too interwoven. Because even then there was an earlier form of globalization. And it was a very good argument. It was a very well-written book. He just got the timing wrong, essentially.
So sorry, I'm reading questions while I'm also listening to your answers, and I'm just that's a difficult thing. There's a question that has come from Natalie Gilbert, who's a graduate student in our master's program. And you may need to bring the rest of us up to speed on the question itself because it's quite specific. She simply is asking what your main takeaways or thoughts are on the white paper released by the Chinese Communist Party on the status of Taiwan.
I am not familiar with it.
Okay.
So that's an easy answer.
Yes.
You know, and I mean, it's something I'm not familiar with. Yeah. Okay.
Fair enough. And then finally, we had an audience member who was asking you if you could compare the situation of Communist Party structure in the Soviet Union versus China and how that may have long-term historical influence on the situation
Xi Jinping is completely determined not to be another Gorbachev. You know, whatever Gorbachev did, he'll do the opposite. You know, Gorbachev opened the society and the economy. Xi will open the economy a little bit, then close it down a bit and never open the society. Don't be like the Chinese look down on Gorbachev as a complete failure. In a sense, I actually think Gorbachev is one of the great men of the 20th century and will one day be revered in Russia, as Chiang Kai-shek will one day be revered in Taiwan, in China. I mean, I'm an optimist on that, but a long-range optimist, kind of. The Chinese Communist Party is not so much communist, it's very Leninist. It's all about control, about power and intimidation. You know, Lenin asked the question, who controls whom, nothing else mattered. You know, how much I can intimidate you, there's nothing else to know about our relationship, essentially. And that's where the Chinese Communist Party is going, essentially. Now, Kevin Rudd, who's a China specialist and the former ambassador to Australia, but he's a Mandarin speaker. He said that Xi Jinping is strangling the goose that made China rich for 35 years, essentially. Because the more Leninist China becomes, the more dysfunctional its economy becomes.
Well, that gives us quite a bit to think about, and that I think concludes our Q&A, which somehow managed to force our speaker into giving almost a completely second lecture. So, so thank you very much.
My pleasure.
For your patience,
just great
for
being
answering our
here.
questions, and thank you to the audience and those who connected with us over Zoom. As a reminder, for those of you who are here, I'm sorry I have not developed the technology to deliver this digitally, but there is a reception with refreshments, as well as Borka Tomljenović's books, which are on the table on the back, and everyone is encouraged to take a copy if it interests you. Thank you very much. Thank you again to our speaker.
Pleasure.
And,
My pleasure.
And we look forward to seeing you at our events throughout the term. Thank you so much.